Great. Well, it's 2 o'clock. My name's Adrian Bertrand. I'm from Six Capitals Advisory. It's fantastic to be able to co-host you for today's UK PACT South Africa funded webinar. We have people joining currently, so what we'll do is we'll just chat through a few housekeeping suggestions, and then we'll start with the formal welcome and introductions. But if we can just ask you to please keep your microphones on mute and to turn off your video if you're not speaking or presenting. Presenters are encouraged to keep their videos on when they're presenting, please. If you have a question, we encourage you to please put your questions in the chat function. Unfortunately, some of our speakers have got other engagements and won't necessarily be available for the Q&A. So we really do want to encourage people to put their questions in the chat function during the course of the webinar. And that will mean that the appropriate speakers are able to respond to your question. Also, just to mention that we are recording the webinar, and it will be made available to participants after the webinar. And there are a number of other resources which are also available to participants, which we'll be directing you to during the course of the webinar. Should you have any technical issues with Zoom and connectivity, please won't you contact Safaku. His email address is there. You should have received his email address in the reminder and on the registrations. So please do get in touch with Safaku if you have any challenges. We're really looking forward to a good session today. We're looking forward to your interaction and input, and we look forward to some good conversations. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Brent Kuti for the formal welcoming and introduction. Thank you, Brent.
Hi, thank you very much, Adrian. Yes, yeah, so welcome to this webinar. We're hoping this will be the first of a couple of webinars that you participate in. Yeah, so as Adrian is, I'll quickly just run you through the agenda. We start with a quick welcome introductions, which I'll do now. Then we will, give you a quick overview of the broader project we're working on, and as Adrian mentioned, all the resources you can access through that and where you can access them. And then we'll get into the meat of the presentation. There'll be a quick introduction to climate change, and after that we'll move on to to the kind of corporate reporting landscape and climate-related disclosure and how they interplay. And then there'll be a question and answer session, and then at the end, and after that, there'll be a quick survey at the end of the webinar, just to get your feedback on exactly how how you've experienced the webinar, how we can how we can better these webinars, how we can tweak them going forward to make them even more useful. So we'd really appreciate it if you could stay on for for the quick presentation at the end. Now, in terms of our of our speakers, so you've already met Adrian. Adrian Bertrand. He's co-founder and practice head ESG advisory from Six Capitals Advisory. He and his colleague Melanie Smith, who's a practice head for research and reporting at Six Capitals Advisory, they'll be talking you through the corporate reporting landscape and climate disclosure, an area which they are very experienced in and have spent many years working on. And then we're very fortunate to have, during the introduction to climate change, to have some very esteemed colleagues from WWF South Africa that will deal with that. It will be, Cedrin Mudre, who's an investment analyst at WWF South Africa, will be presenting that. And together with him will be Louise Nadir. Now, Louise is senior manager at climate change for the climate change portfolio at WWF South Africa, and she's also a commissioner in the Presidential Climate Change Commission. So there's few people, more qualified in South Africa to tell us about climate change than Louise and Seren. Okay, so I'll quickly move on and just give you a quick introduction to the project. So as Adrian mentioned, this project is being funded by UK Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transitions. This is a fund set up by the UK government. Its whole purpose is to support developing and emerging nations in meeting their national determined contributions. So that is the targets that they've set in terms of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. and to help, and in order to meet the Paris Agreement goals. And so the whole purpose there is to try and limit dangerous climate change, and to help developing countries to do that. The UK PACT is a demand-driven initiative, so it is being, the whole point is to try and respond to demand from the host of the partner countries. They're working very closely with the partners introducing the projects implementing the projects in the countries like ourselves. And the real idea is to kind of address barriers and constraints to clean growth. So the idea is not just to reduce emissions, but also to help a accelerated climate transition, a transition to a low carbon economy that is just and inclusive. The UK PACT will run from 2018 to 2022. There is talk of extending that into future phases. It is a sizable project. It's £60 million that they've been committed to this, and it's being driven by the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Now, as I mentioned, UK PACT it's got a number of country programs. So the South African program is one of the country programs. The other ones are being run in China, Colombia, Malaysia, and Mexico. So as you can see, we're in good company here. It is a global initiative. The UK PACT is also funding a couple of other initiatives, including a Green Recovery Challenge Fund, where funding proposals are taken from countries, from developing countries, in order to fund innovative climate change solutions there. And it's also providing skill shares. It's a convent where it's trying to share some of the expertise built up in the UK in terms of low carbon transition with the developing countries. Now, the South Africa-UK PACT country program was launched last year, and 10 projects have been funded. Just over £3 million has been allocated to these 10 projects. As you can see, most of them are in the energy space, and then the rest are equally split between sustainable transport and sustainable finance. And the project that I'm going to be introducing to you now that we're implementing is part of the sustainable finance portfolio. I just want to emphasize again the words of Nigel Casey, the High Commissioner to the British Embassy in South Africa, that just really emphasizes the fact that the projects are aimed at supporting green, resilient, and inclusive economic growth in South Africa. So it's not a case of focusing on climate or even the environment at the cost of other goals. It's really trying to foster sustainable development and to put South Africa on a more sustainable, but also a more inclusive and a more optimistic growth trajectory going forward. If you want to know more about the South African UK PACT program, there's a couple of websites that you'll see when we share the slides, that tells you all about all the other countries and also about all the other 9 projects that have been funded in South Africa. And then also you'll see this address a couple of times as we go through the project. But we've also created, for this presentation, we've also created a dedicated page on the DNA Economics website that hosts all the outputs and all the tools and information pieces we're developing as part of this project that are easily accessible from there. They're all free. They're free to use. They also invite to the training sessions and the future capacity building sessions will also all be hosted there. Right. So that is UK PACT in a nutshell, in the South Africa UK PACT project. Now I'll just give you a quick overview of the broader project we're trying to implement, of which this training is a part. So our project, what we try to do with our project is really to try and address the barriers to analyzing and reporting on climate-related financial risks and opportunities. And the reason for that really is to provide investors, big and small, so also retail investors, with the information to make sensible decisions about climate change and factor this into their investment decisions. And we're doing this by following the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosure. You'll be told a lot more about that later on. So this might all seem a bit strange now, but you'll start understanding all of this as we go through the webinar. To do this, we've put together a strong project team that combines international best practice experience with modeling and understanding climate change and climate disclosure, and then also with local partners that have a very deep understanding of South Africa's climate policy and also its environmental, social, and governance landscape. So what we're trying to achieve by this project is to speed up the use of detailed, useful, and time-based climate-related disclosures in investment decision-making in South Africa. So in order to put in, to place investments on a more sustainable trajectory and to reduce the risk of stranded assets or assets being misallocated as well, this transition is happening. Now, the project mostly focuses on transition risk. Again, a concept that you'll be more familiar with, after this webinar. And we're focusing on listed equities, and particularly also the asset management and pension funds industries. But there is we are planning to increase the scope of that to also look at physical risk of climate change during future phases of the current project. Now, we also, it's largely a demand-led process. We're trying to get input from beneficiaries. So we're speaking to a lot of stakeholders, and we're also hoping that these training sessions will also help us understand exactly what people need in order to understand the impacts of climate change on their investments, and what tools and other guides we can provide to help you with this, with this going forward. As I mentioned, we've brought together a big and very experienced project team in order to implement this project. I'm from DNA Economics. We're a consulting company based in Pretoria. We've been doing climate change policy work for well over a decade. So really, this project was conceptualized to try and take some of those learnings and bring them into the general discussion. We're also being supported by colleagues from the Greenhouse, who is a sustainability engineering company based in Cape Town, who are also intricately involved in climate policy in South Africa, particularly in terms of the modeling of the low carbon transition and the impacts of the low carbon transition. Then also our colleagues from Vivid Economics are based in the UK. They're a global economic consulting firm that have really taken a lead in understanding climate risk and disclosing climate risk, working with all the large international organizations that are focusing on this, and particularly through their sister company Planetrix, they built up a large set of skills and tools that can be used for this purpose. And you'll learn much more about this as this project progresses. Then also, our colleagues from WWF South Africa, I think, need no introduction. WWF South Africa has been one of the kind of leading forces in terms of making sure that climate change is, it comes to the fore in South Africa. It's always very visible in policy dialogues, and really done a lot of good work to move the climate change agenda forward in South Africa. And then lastly, but not least, our colleague Six Capitals Advisory, who are coordinated this seminar. Adrian and his team, they have a long history in sustainability disclosure, in all manner of ESG, helping to really help corporates and other clients to understand their risks in the ESG area, but also to publicize these risks and to disclose these risks in a way that's really meaningful and useful to their stakeholders. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide. Just giving you a broad idea of how we structured the project. I think really interesting. So, but this pyramid shows is there different levels of engagement with this project. So we are at the highest level. We are putting out a number of literature and communications around climate change and climate risks and opportunities. We're also having then a series of webinars, which this is one. The webinars together do form a training course. So it'll be great if you participated in all four of them, but also we've split out the webinars as their own category here, because it's also perfectly acceptable if you would just like to attend one or two of these webinars in order to get very specific pieces of information. That's also, of course, your prerogative, but there is the opportunity to follow all four of the webinars, and they have been structured as a learning course, so that'll give you a very good foundation in terms of understanding climate risks and opportunities and how that impacts investment decisions. Then we're working with the investment and pension fund industry, so through the associations, so Batseta and ASISA, and also the JSE are direct steering committee members, and then we have a large number of companies and institutions that are supporting us as an external advisory group to help us make sure that the content we provide is useful and interesting. And really, there are three streams of work that we're doing in this project. The first one is capacity building and awareness raising, and this is what you're participating in today. And we will have a number of different formats that we're doing this. We're having these short webinars, but then we're also having longer sessions, focused largely on the pension fund and asset management industries. We will really be digging into some of these issues, but also further on in this project, we will be providing training on the use of of scenarios in the analysis. We'll also be developing a toolkit to support the analysis of climate risks and opportunities, and we'll be providing training later on in the year on how to use that toolkit. So please, if you want to stay up to date with all of this, please visit our website regularly, and then you'll get all information on this. Now, as I mentioned, we're also developing the toolkit. The toolkit will help to make a lot of these theoretical issues practical. It's there to support South African institutions in understanding their risks, disclosing their risks, but also quantifying their risks. We'll also provide some scenario development guidance. And as part of this toolkit, there will be a large database of information sources, both local and international, that can be drawn upon in order to understand climate risks more. And again, as I mentioned, to quantify these risks. And then also, very excitingly, the last part of the project is we're going to be doing a best practice example of how you would calculate and then disclose the transition risk inherent in a portfolio of assets. So the portfolio we've chosen is 50 of the most highly invested companies on the JSE. So we're currently working with our colleagues at Vivid in order to calculate, exactly how a transition to a low carbon economy is, internationally is going to impact on the markets and the cost of these companies, and we'll put that out as a publication towards the end of this project. So we're really excited about that, and that should provide a good idea of exactly the extent of the challenge that is faced by South African companies, and also the importance of really understanding these risks and opportunities. As I mentioned, we've already put out quite a number of publications. So if you could go to our website, so it's DNA Economics /pages/SA_climate_disclosure. We've done a research piece looking at international best practice in terms of financial institutions and how to disclose climate risks and opportunities. We've also looked at the climate financial disclosure landscape in South Africa. Who's disclosing, what are the trends behind disclosing, challenges that people face, and so on. And then our colleagues at Six Capitals have looked at, again, this portfolio of 50 of the largest companies in the JSE and created fact sheets that actually summarize the extent to which they report on their climate risks and opportunities, and the extent to which this is aligned with the TCFD and the TCFD guidance. And then also all of this has been brought together in a nice accessible publication that was put out as a special edition of the Lehu Edu publication series that takes all of this information and distills it into easier to engage language, shorter articles, in order to make sure that this knowledge is easily accessible and gets into the wider world. So please, if you go and have a look at our website, like I say, all the resources are there, and also our contact details are also on there. So please feel free to engage with the project going forward, and we'll happily. We'll happily engage with you, and also keep an eye out for future training sessions and future applications that will be forthcoming. Well, thank you very much. That's the end of the kind of broad overview. So I ran through this quite quickly, but the reason for that was we want to get into the meat of the presentation, because that's the reason why you're here, is you want to learn, you don't want to hear about projects. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Brent, and good day, everyone. Safako, if you could stop sharing, and Louise, if you could bring up our slides on screen. So good day all, and thanks for joining the session. My name is Seren Madre. I'm an investment analyst within WWF's Sustainable Finance team and a member of the WWF Global Finance practice. My team's work focuses on integrating environmental risks into the financial sector, and climate change and the risks associated with climate change is a big part of this. And that is why I'm excited to be part of this project and here with you all today. So moving on to the next slide is a picture from the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. And as you can see, right up at the top list is extreme weather and climate action failure. And this has been part of the top risks presented by business leaders for a number of years now. And 2021 is just one year in a series of global risk reports from the World Economic Forum that's been highlighting climate change and climate risks as a major risk that business leaders and leaders across the world are trying to factor into their business management processes. And this is a big part of why we're here today and why we're working with the financial sector to deepen the understanding of the links between climate risks, investments, lending, and insurance. Many may be familiar with climate change and many may not be, but most will agree that the potential impacts of climate change presents a real risk to our lives and livelihoods, as shown in the global risk reports and countless other reports, articles, initiatives. The continued emissions of greenhouse gases at current levels will cause further warming of the planet, and this warming could lead to damaging economic and social consequences. The large-scale and long-term nature of climate change presents a problem that is uniquely challenging, especially in the context of economic decision-making. Many organizations incorrectly perceive the implications of climate change to be long-term and therefore not necessarily relevant to the decisions made today. This is one of our most significant and perhaps most misunderstood risks that organizations face. I would like to pause here to take a quick poll. Safako, if you could load the poll onto the screen for the attendees. We would like to get a sense from the audience of what's the basic areas of climate change that you struggle with understanding. So if you could pick one of the options of the screen in terms of which area of climate change topics are you least comfortable with? So is it greenhouse gas definitions, the need for 1.5 degree targets, carbon budgets, or the carbon tax? You can see some responses coming in, and that's great. It seems carbon budgets are leading the poll so far, along with the carbon tax and greenhouse gas definitions. We'll just give it a moment for people to continue to responding. Fantastic. It looks like carbon budgets are the area where most people would like further knowledge. And also the carbon tax and greenhouse gas definitions come in joint second, with the need for a 1.5 degree target coming in last place, which is fantastic. So we can close the poll there. Thanks, Safako, for that. And thanks everyone for responding to these polls. So with that, this is why myself and my colleague, Louise Naudier, would like to take some time to give you all an introduction into the basics understanding of climate change. My colleague Louise, as alluded to earlier about Brent, is one of the leading experts in climate change in South Africa and within WWF South Africa, and will be helping us all today in getting to grips with the 101 on climate change. If you have any questions, please pop them into the chat and we'll do our best to get to them, or save them till the end for the Q&A session. So with that, we're going to be jumping into an intro on climate change to give us a basic understanding of what is climate change, to help us in getting, when we delve deeper into the topics addressed in these webinar sessions. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. I look forward and hope to see you in further sessions where we delve further into looking at climate risks, opportunities, and the best practice around climate-related disclosures. I will now hand over to Louise. Louise, over to you. Thanks.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for all the glowing introduction. I hope I'll live up to it. So I understand my job here to be, I'm going to give you 4 foundational concepts around climate change. And I see that carbon budgets was quite a high one, so I will address that. And I also saw that people understand the need for a 1.5 target, which is very encouraging. So, I don't need to go into that for hours. So the first concept is just to understand that relationship between greenhouse gases and the temperature. So on the left-hand side here, it's my left. Is it the other way around for you? Anyway, so the orangey colored things are the human activities that create these emissions. And on the other side, the blue things are, you know, how the natural system reabsorbs the greenhouse gases we've emitted. And it's the excess emissions that humans are releasing that the natural system can't absorb that is driving global warming. And it's the concentration in the atmosphere of these gases. So if you think of a cup of tea and you continually adding spoons of sugar and so on, that's in relation to the concentration. So it seems to me, you know, from the poll that people do understand this quite clearly. And you'll be aware that on Monday, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a huge body of scientists under the UN, released its latest report on the physical science and what that science is telling us. So, you know, people can go and dig in more deeply. There's a summary for policymakers, which will give more detail. Okay, so the IPCC, I think it's not even last year, but the year before, released this report on 1.5 degrees. They were asked to investigate the question of how much worse is it at 1.5 than 2, etc. And do we still have a chance of remaining or stabilizing at least at 1.5? And the answer was that there is, every half a degree makes a difference. So we are already 1.2 degrees, this is global average, not in South Africa, 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures, because it's industrialization that has been driving these emissions by humans. And so, you know, the benchmark is the pre-industrial temperature. So we're 1.2 degrees above that already. So we're very, you know, close to the 1.5. And if we go over 1.5 and we get to 2 degrees, I mean, you know, we don't think we can pull back from that. And some of the things are irreversible and many are catastrophic. So, you know, 1.5 is really where we want to be heading. And then just to give you a picture of the emissions in South Africa, where they come from. So I would just like to acknowledge that this slide and a couple of the others come from a presentation I attended yesterday, where NBI, BUSA, and the Boston Consulting Group are doing these deeper dives into pathways to, you know, 1.5 aligned pathways for the various emitting sectors in South Africa. And so there, you know, there's the profile of our emissions, and this is in megatons, these gray blocks. So it's 225 on the left there, electricity production, 225 megatons. And so you can see the other sectors there. This transport block is just the fuel combustion emissions, because the emissions from creating the petrol and diesel and paraffin and so on sit here under petrochemicals. Okay, so let's come to the carbon budget concept, which people have said they'd like to understand better. So there's a relationship between the concentration of these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and the temperature rise. And for different greenhouse gases, and people can Google which those are, but like the really big one, in terms of the quantity we emit and the impact on climate, is carbon dioxide. And then another one is methane, and methane doesn't stay in the atmosphere as long as carbon does, but while it's there, it really accelerates the temperature. So different gases have a different, that's called climate forcing effect. And we talk about carbon dioxide equivalent, which means all the greenhouse gases, because their temperature effect is translated back to the equivalent to what it would be for carbon dioxide. And if you think about this ever-increasing concentration, we've already locked in certain kind of temperature rise with the emissions that are already there. And then the IPCC, the report that came out on Monday, looks at what point will we have forced 1.5, and therefore how much emissions remaining can we still afford to emit? And this is what they found. So they look at, and I mean, the gamblers in the room will understand this well. They look at the percentage chance of stabilizing at 1.5 degrees. And then if you're willing to settle for those kind of odds, what is the remaining carbon budget from 2020 on? And they're saying that if you, for 67% chance, I mean, I'd like better odds than that for the planet, but for 67% chance, we've got 400 gigatons of CO2 emissions left, which is 12 years of what we emitted in 2018. And if you more risk, you know, if you've got a higher appetite for risk and you're willing to take only a 50% chance, then the budget is bigger. So I hope that relationship is clear, and people must please ask questions about it. Yeah, I think that's, and just, I think people don't understand this. This is forever. We can't emit more than this forever. And otherwise we just start it again. And the IPCC also says that, you know, we have to end up at net zero by 2050. So this is the only carbon budget we have that we can still use to do whatever we, for example, to put up renewable energy turbines emits emissions in the production of those things and so on. So, you know, we better use this carbon budget wisely. And as you can see, the next kind of 10 years is really critical. And then we have to be net zero 2050. And net zero means, you know, those emissions we emit and those reabsorbed by nature must net out at zero. So this is just one way of thinking about that carbon budget. These are the reserves around the world of fossil fuels. And those gigatons, you know, the bubbles are the amount of gigatons of CO2 that would be emitted if we extracted that and then used it, processed it in some way, whether it's burning it in cars, burning the coal or whatever. So if you were to add up all those numbers, you can see that it's, you know, really exceeds the global carbon budget. So we can't do this. We can't use up all these reserves. And that, you know, this is one of the things about stranded assets that increasingly financiers and investors don't want to invest in stuff that ultimately can't be pulled out of the ground and for which the market is shrinking. Okay, now what is South Africa's carbon budget? We derive our own carbon budget for the country from something called the peak, plateau, and decline trajectory range. So government has set us, and we were all part of it, that we would, by 2025, peak our emissions. In other words, from then on, we're going no higher. We would plateau those for 10 years to 2035, and then we would bring them down from there. 479, that was our emissions in 2018. So that was what was in policy before. Now, in the latest nationally determined contribution, which is a commitment you make at the UN, they have in the draft that our emissions in 2025 would not exceed 510 megatons. and that by 2030, we would drop that down to 440. And from there, you know, go closer to net zero. So that is a major move forward for the country. And so there's no more plateau. You know, we're going down from 2025. So it's a peak and decline range. And then these clouds of emissions that I've put there, that's your global budget. So if that's your target of your maximum amounts that you're going to allow yourself to emit by certain years, if you squish up all the emissions under that into a big ball, that's your carbon budget. And then the Presidential Commission had a set of meetings about responding to this draft nationally determined contribution that government put out. And we then made a proposal to the president to drop that 440 down to 420, which is a further improvement. And we hope that the president is receptive to that and that the Department of Environmental Affairs therefore adjusts the commitments. However, there is a concept called your fair share of the global carbon budget, and I will come back to that a bit later. But if South Africa was to be in line with our fair share of that global budget, then our emissions should be around 300 megatons by 2030. Okay, then I don't know if anybody has questions on this concept of the carbon budget.
Louise, there is a question from Nicole Martins. She asks, does the IPCC report give a best odds scenario, but what is the percentage chance and emissions budget associated with that best chance?
Thank you. Yes, Nicole, thank you for that. That's exactly, you've hit the nail on the head, because the IPCC, it doesn't prescribe. You know, they're very careful to always say, well, we are scientists, we don't prescribe what policymakers or corporate should do. But it says, you know, we have a 67% chance of stabilizing at 1.5 if we don't emit more than 400 gigatons from now forever. Then there's also, you know, one where they look at better chances than that, like a 75% chance and so on. So the big message from the IPCC report is it is still possible. It is going to take everyone doing everything, and the next 10 years are critical. You know, and the kinds of decisions that the country has to make is don't invest in infrastructure that's going to lock us into, you know, further emissions. Everything we do now has to be at worst, not increase the problem, you know, not do more harm, and at best reduce emissions. And everything has to be mindful of the coming climate impacts and be resilient in the face of that. So if I turn to the third concept I want to talk about, which is the two kinds of risk, and Brent alluded to this in his introduction. The one is biophysical impacts. So the climate changes, there's certain things that then happen in the climate system and in climate patterns. And those biophysical changes have a direct impact on us and our activities and our economies, and then some knock-on impacts of that. So one of the sort of ways in which we in South Africa will particularly feel climate change is we are a water-stressed country already, and our own government's studies have said we are likely that we're going to get much drier in the west of the country and potentially wetter in the east of the country. So that, you know, has an impact on, direct impact on agriculture and then human health and then those things have a knock-on impact on other things like food security, productivity of the workforce if they're ill and so on. I must say, I've been thinking that we have to adopt a siesta approach to farm work. I don't think people are going to be able to work in the heat of the day. Okay, and then the other kinds of risk is transition risk. So let me come to that just now. I'm just going to skip those. What's happened here? Why is the screen blank? Oh, okay. So I'm just going to now give you a couple of tools where you yourself can dig deeper into, some of the biophysical risks. So this first thing is, and every slide of mine has got the link to where you can go and find this out. South African scientists did a study called, and it's actually an ongoing thing, it doesn't stop, the long-term adaptation scenarios. And on my slide, you can see the kinds of risks and need to adapt that they identified in particular sectors and particular realms of human activity. So that's a good, and these fact sheets at the bottom, they're quick and easy reads, and they're very accessible. So you can go and look there. Then we developed globally this thing called the water risk filter, where you can go and figure out the water risk to your business along a range of parameters, but also including climate change. And one can also ask for a bespoke report on the specific risks to your business. So you can explore the risks, you can assess them, you can get recommendations as to how you could respond, and then also, what is the financial dimension of that. And then this is quite amazing. The Ipcc report, one of the unusual things about it this time is they actually have issued regional reports like, Southern Africa, Latin America, etc., and the kinds of what the science is telling us about regional impacts. But in South Africa, because it's quite hard, it's a global climate system, how do you actually talk about it in quite a level of granularity? But in South Africa, the CSIR actually did this, the Green Book, which you can go and type in your municipality and see what the likely risks there are and what the adaptation dimensions need to be. And so, if you're going to invest in something in a particular area in South Africa, you're going to go and check what your exposure is there to the biophysical impacts. Then the second kind of risk is what Brent called transition risk. So this is the risk to our economy that while the world moves in a low carbon direction, what exposure does that leave us with? And what is the cost of us not doing something about it? Of not also re-gearing our economy for these new conditions. So if you look, and this slide is thanks to NBI, those of you who know Steve Collins, the slide is always in his packs, but there you can see our exports and imports. Coal making up a big piece of it. Then, the metals, which are very emissions intensive to produce. And so as the world demand for coal drops, that's our market dissolving under our feet. And a big one, I work in the transport sector. A big one is that our car manufacturers, our original equipment manufacturers, we're still producing internal combustion engines, and all around the world. I mean, the EU's just, I think they said 2030, no more internal combustion engines to be sold, etc. So unless, we manage to attract investment into production of electric vehicles in this country, that's a whole sector and all the jobs and all the GDP from that disappears. So there are major risks here, but there, you know, we also have world-class resources in the platinum group metals, which some of those, you know, are needed in low carbon electricity and electric vehicle manufacture. So WWF did this report that you can go and look at, which looks at which metals do we have in South Africa that will be needed for metals and other resources. Sorry, let me rather say mineral resources that will be needed for a global and local low carbon economy. And so, you know, part of that transition risk, the flip side is the transition opportunities. So this is where money should be flowing, is into the transition opportunities. This is just more about that exposure that around the world, different countries are starting to price carbon, and they also starting to put up trade barriers. If our exports do not embody an adequate enough carbon price in the form of the carbon tax, that's how we decided to do it in South Africa, then, you know, we will encounter border tax adjustments and other kinds of barriers. The EU just, and we sort of had a bit of a scrape through for South Africa. The EU announced that it was going to, now what do they call this thing? A carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's putting in place, which would be very disadvantageous for our exports. And luckily, you know, there has been an agreement brokered that it'll be phased in more slowly. So, yeah, and I mean, investors are shifting. You know, even in South Africa, that Nedbank, for example, has come out with a strong policy on not investing in fossil fuels anymore. For me, the big one was when BlackRock, you know, came out saying that where it invests, it is going to be asking about the carbon intensity of those businesses. Yeah, so let me pause there about transition risk and see if there are any questions.
Louise, there are some questions in the chat. The first one is going back a bit about the carbon budget. And Nicole asked if the carbon budget takes into account the IEA's latest report, which suggests that there should be no fossil fuel investment with immediate effect and coal phase out by 2040. Then there's a second question from Nwabo, who says he understands the theories about scenarios, but he wonders if these scenarios consider the socioeconomic factors and all the political implications of this, and if that's addressed anywhere. And then lastly, there's a question about if there's enough financial support for the just transition, for example, in the agriculture sector, and are there any incentives from the banks to support this?
So I'm going to Lonwabo. Your question is highly pertinent, and it's my last concept that I'm coming with. So I'm just going to quickly try and address some of the others. So South Africa's carbon budget projection. It's based on a study done by, originally it was based on a study done by a group of really hotshot academics at the University of Cape Town. They are a national resource and a global resource in terms of calculating all these things. And what they did was calculate what can we reduce our emissions by. You know, so if we did this, how much emissions would that reduce? And then they add all these things together, and then they said, you know, this is the curve that we can commit to. Of course, since then, the world has moved on, for one thing. And also, it is also a question not only of like, what can we do, but of political will and corporate will to actually do it. So that kind of target of what our emissions limits should be is also a contested, it's sort of the best that different stakeholders in South Africa are willing to settle on. Yeah. So yes, in a sense that it is all evidence-based, it does take into account the IEA's report. I don't think that, but that will be the debate Lonwabo and I would have. I don't think we are planning quick enough to get out of coal. But then, that's also because we have big fossil fuel companies in whose business interests it is to try and delay that as much as possible. At Neemal and Equality, I don't criticize them for that. It is their job to defend their business models, but their business model and their job is not necessarily the same as public good for everybody. So in terms of financial support, Marika, people in the sector tell me that there is the will to invest in low carbon and climate resilient things, but there is not enough projects. There's more money than where they can find opportunity to invest in. But I think, others who are more expert in that realm would better answer that question. And I think investors will go where they see the potential for great returns. And, when you're coming off a low base of, like, even some of these smaller entrepreneurial companies, which have products and services that could grow exponentially in a, as a low carbon offering, I think that if people could find those opportunities, they would put their money there. Okay, and then Nicole, I think it's the most significant barriers are that there's still a lot of money to be made in fossil fuels, and that the incumbents who want to still realize the value out of their assets and so on. Okay, so let's come to the highly relevant question that Lonwabo raised. I think we have to think about this in two ways. The one is, okay, so let's talk about the cost of inaction. If we don't deal with climate change, both the biophysical and the transition risks, we will be destroying the developmental gains that we've made in South Africa, post-democracy, which are not insignificant, even though we're still the most unequal and poverty-stricken country. So, almost the best way to foster development is to deal with these things and not stick our heads in the sand. But it is true that there is a debate globally about how much should a developing country do compared to the developed nations. So let me look at this. So these big balls on this map show the historical accumulated emissions of these different countries. Because remember, it's the more and more and more you put into the atmosphere, like teaspoonfuls of sugars that collect there. So, we can see, who historically has emitted the most. And so they bear a historical responsibility. So in the global kind of negotiations around this, there's a principle called common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. So we all have a common responsibility to tackle the climate crisis, but we have a differentiated responsibility because, we didn't all create this problem to an equal extent. And then the respective capabilities is about, a country like ours where the Fsca is at the moment quite cash strapped. does not necessarily have oodles and oodles of money. So according to our respective capabilities, we must do our best. And if you take the global carbon budget, then we have a duty to do our fair share, and the fairness is based on this historical contribution. We have a duty to do our fair share of the global effort required to keep within that global carbon budget. And we have the right to access our fair share of funding available, technologies, capacity building, and so on. So that is one of the big global debates. But I just want everyone to remember, it's going to take everyone doing everything. And in South Africa, people think it's a big problem that our electricity is completely coal-based, or, so very much coal-based. But actually, that's a fantastic opportunity. It means that we in South Africa can very easily reduce our emissions by, moving much faster and to much greater extent to renewables. The technologies exist. It's an easy thing to do. So, okay, then you will remember I said we all have to get to net zero by 2050. On the global stage, these are the countries, it's not an exhaustive list, but these are the countries who already are saying that they're heading for net zero by 2050. South Africa has not yet done it, but from the Presidential Commission in our recommendation to the President, we said that that should be in, it should be in our nationally determined contribution, our commitment at the UN, because it then sends a signal to global finance and investors and, the finance from other governments like UK PACT monies and so on, that we are heading there, correctly heading there, and therefore we become a more attractive investment destination. But if we add up all the commitments from the different countries, and this is as at May 2021, and it's a website called Climate Action Tracker, and it tracks this in real time as countries submit their commitments. You can see that this, if you look at the graph on the left, that broad green band with the dotted line is what the global emissions should track as if we're to hit the 1.5. And on the right-hand side, you can see those up-down arrows are saying how far we are away with the existing pledges on the table, how much of a gap, how far away we are from where we should be. So this is the political problem. And yeah, the COP26 this year in November, which is the UN's climate meeting, countries before then must submit better NDCs. And so, they hopefully close this gap, but it's not looking that great at the moment. Oh, that's just all the UNFCCC jargon. Yeah, so let me pause there because I think there's some questions in the chat.
Louise, there's no additional questions. Wendy and myself have been replying to some of the comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much for doing that, Sarah and Wendy. Yeah, so maybe I can just turn to, what some corporate action that is happening and some opportunities to get involved. So the first thing is that NBI, C40 cities and WWF are in a partnership where we convene a thing called the Alliance for Climate Action South Africa. It's one of about 7, and Australia is about to join. So, about 8 such alliances around the world. and the sort of underlying raison d'etre of the alliances is that governments can commit at a national level, but a government doesn't control economic actors in the economy. So, you know, it can create an enabling environment, but it can't make all of you do, unless it regulates some things. But I mean, in general, you know, the economy has its own way of having dynamics that shift things. So these are companies, cities, and other not national government actors that are committing to what you can see there on the screen. And yeah, a big thing, a factor of business is becoming a company's behavior in the policy advocacy space. I won't go deep into that, but you know, there are now people who starting to track that, and yeah, it's huge reputational risk, but might also be investment risk and so on. So there's our Alliance for Climate Action. We really would welcome anyone who wants to join that. And then there's the Science-Based Targets Initiative, where a company can commit to a 1.5 degree aligned emission reduction target and develops plans to get themselves there. And that's it from me. And I hope I didn't completely go over my time.
Thank you, Louise. No, I don't think, yeah, you went past your time. I think we're making good progress. Good afternoon, everyone. I just realized now that my camera was off. I'm Melanie Smith from Six Capitals. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I am going to start sharing our slides for Six Capitals. Let me just bring these up. Here we go. So this last section will be presented by Adrian and myself. And we'll take a look at corporate reporting and the climate-related disclosure and how that kind of fits in with the mouthful that WWF just explained on the science side of things. I want to preface this, or kind of put a disclaimer to this slides that we're going into. These are kind of snapshot overviews. People that work in the industry very well will yeah, see there's kind of a very condensed slide pack that we put together. We can do an entire webinar on corporate reporting alone. So yeah, it's very condensed. So it's not intended to kind of depict the entire reporting landscape in these few slides. So let's quickly go into corporate reporting to try and understand how the science that WWF just explains fits into corporate reporting, and why it's important to for companies as well as investors to start disclosing climate-related data, and how that fits into yeah, the bigger reporting picture. So we can think about corporate reporting as basically your link with between companies and their investors and stakeholders that they use as a periodic, and that they use periodically to communicate their organization's financial and some call it non-financial information. I think there's good reason to probably not call it non-financial information, because it does carry material impacts at the end of the day. But yeah, so that's basically short what corporate reporting is. And then when we look at kind of the players in the field, I think people that work in this area and probably many other stakeholders tend to think about reporting only kind of reduced to JSE listed companies that tend to report, but it is a bit wider than that. You do get public entities as well as constitutional entities that are per the Public Finance Management Act required to report on a quarterly basis on their financial and non-financial performance to executive authorities as well as other government stakeholders. I want to just add on the reporting on financial and non-financial performance that the intention is also to kind of report on the value they create, but to keep it more balanced, I think it's fair to say that the intention with reporting is also to show kind of where there's been value destruction or, you know, not necessarily value that's been created, to keep kind of a balanced view on the reporting side of things. Just getting back to constitutional entities and public entities, that usually would entail, you know, bodies like your Independent Electoral Commission, the Municipal Demarcation Board, and the Public Protector for constitutional entities, and then your public entities would include the likes of a Denel and Eskom and Land Bank and IDC and so forth. So most of these entities that I mentioned do reporting through a number of different channels, such as their financial statements, integrated reports, and then sustainability and climate or ESG supplementary reports typically used to disclose more non-financial data, if you will. So now that we have a bit of a sketched a broader picture as to the corporate reporting concept, let's just move over to take a look at the different organizations involved in the landscape. So the reporting landscape is made up of a collection of different organizations, various other initiatives that have their own separate requirements and different supporting infrastructures. Some of these organizations that we're very familiar with include the likes of stock exchanges, your various investors, standard setters, such as the International Integrated Reporting Council, Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards, and so forth. And then our regulators, government that develop mandatory or voluntary requirements for our reporters, as well as supranational organizations such as the United Nations and its various affiliate entities like the UN Global Compact, and your indexes and rating agencies that have their own kind of questionnaires that reporters need to prepare in order to be included in those ratings. So yeah, the reporting landscape has evolved tremendously over the last couple of years, and at best can be described as complex, especially for individuals that are out of this space. And it's complex because we see that corporate reports are being prepared for different audiences, and that requires different information, data and data sets to be disclosed. There's also a number of different reporting initiatives and organizations that all consider various various reporting elements and different reporting standards, as well as frameworks that focus on reporting requirements that need to go out to specific audiences. And your corporate reporting information has been standardized since inception, but over time rules and the standards of reporting has changed, and that's been largely influenced by significant events such as stock market crashes and the introduction of global accounting standards and the inception of things such as the sustainability reporting requirements on different stock exchanges, and then more recently things like the release of the TCFD recommendations. So the next few slides, we'll look at some of the global reporting standard frameworks, and then some climate disclosure initiatives. These are just kind of some of the big ones. We can fill an entire slide with all of these organizations' logos if we had to, but we decided to just focus on some of the big ones. So we have financial institutions can draw on a range of very high quality reporting standards to support their disclosure, and several major global reporting standards are in use today among financial institutions and corporate actors, such as the ones listed on these slides. So corporate reporting of climate-related information has been developed through voluntary reporting standards and frameworks, and each of these reporting standards and frameworks, they have a specific element and audiences that they target for the reporting purposes. So, you know, when one thinks about all of these different reporting frameworks and standards, it does make you wonder kind of why all of these frameworks, and why is it so important for us to have these. So some of the things that come to mind is to have a more effective mechanism to achieve comparable and consistent as well as reliable information with standards, as well as global reporting standards that are frameworks that could be used by businesses to disclose concise and current as well as comparable reporting. That being said, as many know that work in this field, there are numerous requirements, and it can oftentimes be very a real onerous exercise to try and accommodate all of these different standards, and that also means that it doesn't necessarily translate into consistent and reliable information across sectors and industries being reported. And subsequently, we've seen over the last couple of months, in particular, harmonization efforts that are underway by some of these larger standard setters in order to address that long-standing issue of not having data that we can compare on a like-for-like basis. And that's been driven by the corporate through platforms such as the Corporate Reporting Dialogue, which has been put together by the Value Reporting Foundation, which is now being made up by the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB, and the International Integrated Reporting Council, which aims to promote greater coherence, consistency, and comparability between corporate reporting frameworks, standards, and then their related requirements. So although there's movement towards harmonizing global reporting standards, we've seen that the TCFD recommendations in particular are currently the closest framework to being mandated globally, and the framework is expected to be most widely adopted by most companies, and it's also the current best practice for financial institutions to align with the TCFD framework, as the recommendations are most relevant to climate-related disclosure. So that being said, let's just quickly also take a look at some of the global climate disclosure initiatives that are also assisting companies and various organizations with the collection and management of their climate-related data. So to support climate-related data the reporting of climate-related data. A variety of initiatives have been established to help organizations collect and manage the relevant data. The organizations depicted on this, of the logos on the slides, are all involved in, you know, that process. And I think the one that most people are most familiar with in the South African context is probably the science-based target initiatives. That assists companies with, or shows them how much and how quickly they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to prevent the worst effects of climate change. And then you have the greenhouse gas protocol that provides standards, guidance, and tools, as well as training for businesses and government to measure and manage climate warming emissions, and the transition pathway initiative, as well as the natural capital allocation, that all works together with businesses to kind of assist them in managing. So yeah, we've talked a lot about wanting companies and investors to start reporting on climate-related data, but I think a lot of people might, you know, pose the question as to why is there such a desperate need now all of a sudden to start reporting this data. Yeah, I mean, from a benefits perspective, it really stands to benefit a lot of stakeholders, and I mean, yeah, from a risk management perspective and decision-making perspective, it's very important to increase this disclosure, both at a micro and a macro scale, as well as government, to understand their risk exposure, both from a physical and transition risk perspective, and that will assist them to better strategically plan for that transition into a low carbon economy. The physical impacts on financial institutions through their clients' exposure to climate shocks, you know, that's kind of also one of the kind of pressing things that investors need, financial institutions need to understand, because those kind of issues increase matters like default risk on loan portfolios, and lowering asset values over the long term. Financial institutions will also be negatively affected if climate change impacts the health of the broader economy. And so in addition to reducing the value of assets, physical risks increase the liabilities, you know, in the end for the likes of insurance, which will then also see uptick in frequency of insurance claims in the end. So let's just take pause a moment around the stakeholders that stand to benefit, and kind of zooming in on kind of what the benefits for each of the various parties are, and why it's so crucial that all stakeholders involved that are able to, or that should report, you know, start upping their game in terms of their reporting. So disclosure, I mean, I touched on it in the previous slide, is vital for investors and asset owners and asset managers, as climate-related impacts are expected to impact the value of companies and as well as other assets, which then over the long term impacts on the risk-adjusted returns. Linked to this has also been the increased realization that investing in companies or assets without considering climate-related financial impacts will be in breach of their fiduciary duty. So in order to manage risk from an investment perspective and to fulfill their fiduciary duties, it is crucial that we get the investor community on board sooner rather than later. The question around the fiduciary duty, that also can be extended to boards and directors of companies, since these climate-related impacts and risks may also threaten the continued operation of companies. Then, for civil society, the disclosure of climate-related data is very important, as it is often used to hold institutions to account with respect to the impacts of their activities on climate change, and it also helps them better target different institutions and organizations that are resistant to change, and to be able to measure the impacts of various campaigns. So it assists them basically with framing the impacts of climate change in financial terms, that will enable them to effectively communicate with corporates and different financial institutions. From a government perspective, it's the disclosure of these types of data is important, and government stands to benefit from that and greater disclosure. Not only will this inform development of climate change mitigation policies, regulations and frameworks, but government also plays an important role in supporting the reconstruction after natural disasters. So financial disclosures can help to predict the impact of different natural disasters on the government finances by identifying the value of risks that may not be covered by insurance within the national borders. Furthermore, unless transition risks are managed or offset, government may end up shouldering a significant portion of the cost of the inevitable economic restructuring that will be required within their jurisdiction during the transition to a low carbon economy. And these costs will then, in the end, materialize via a reduced tax income and a reduction in the value of assets and increase in contingent liabilities, and then to support vulnerable and shrinking sectors. So from a regulator perspective, it's important to know what the financial impacts of climate change will be on companies, because the large and concentrated financial impacts expected from climate change threatens the stability of the financial sector, and currently, due to a lack of it's not possible to assess the true scale of this type of risk, and that's particularly worrying given the high level of exposure of many financial institutions to capital intensive sectors like fossil fuels that are vulnerable to disruption because of actions to limit climate change. From a banking perspective, they also are exposed to the same risks as their debtors, and consequently will have a keen interest in how climate-related financial impacts may impact the risk profile of their clients. So improved disclosure will also help banks identify climate-related opportunities, such as providing greater financing to green projects, which may be profitable if carbon is priced correctly. Then, I mentioned it briefly in the previous slide. Insurers stand to to benefit from the increased disclosure, and that will act as a cushion against climate-related impacts, which will directly impact their future liabilities. And at the same time, climate-related impacts will impact the value of the insurer's assets and investments. So institutions that provide market information for the financial sector to operate also have a keen interest in climate-related financial disclosure. Not only do institutions like stock exchanges act as standard setters via listing requirements, but they also provide guidance on sustainability disclosure. These institutions have an interest in managing the trust of their investors and ensuring that listed entities provide sufficient information to allow for informed investment and trading decisions. And unexpected large fluctuations in the valuation of listed assets undermine that trust which they've built, and the mispricing of assets resulting from inadequate climate-related financial disclosure could lead to the disorderly adjustment of prices. I'll now be handing over to Adrian, who will take us through some of the existing guidelines, frameworks, and some of the regulations that assist the different shareholders in managing climate risk. And then he'll end us off on some of a few recommendations. Adrian, now I see you've already switched over. Great.
Thank you very much, Melanie. So I've only got 2 slides, and this is really to speak to South African regulatory guidelines and frameworks which support the disclosure of climate risks. We're aware that many of you are from different sectors. Some may be from the investment industry. Others may be working for corporates who are needing to report on climate risk. And so this is just a very high-level summary of some of the guiding frameworks and regulations supporting climate risk disclosure. And I guess one of the key ones when one thinks about the ultimate asset owners or investors, that is the Fsca issued guidance note on the sustainability of investments, which has been one of the more recent publications out of the Fsca, effectively giving guidance to trustees of retirement funds around how they should be considering environmental, social, and governance issues, obviously including climate risk in their investment policy statement, which is, of course, what they use to guide their investment strategies and to contract with their service providers, such as asset consultants and fund managers. Regulation 28, when it was updated just over 10 years ago, for the first time introduced the requirement that boards of trustees consider ESG issues in their investment decision-making. It was included in the preamble to the regulation and also into the principles itself. Again, principles-based guidance. Some funds have seen it as voluntary, but in discussions and public discussions with the Fsca, the view is that it's a hard recommendation. And indeed, the latest information out of the Fsca is they are working on an updated governance directive, which will also be a lot more clear and direct on responsibilities for boards and by implication their service providers in terms of disclosing on ESG issues. National Treasury also released a sustainable finance technical paper, which was really looking at the broader financial system, looking at both retirement funds, banks, insurance companies, fund managers, and really looking at sustainable finance from a South Africa Inc. perspective. That has then been followed up by National Treasury issuing a sustainable finance handbook, which unpacks a lot of the initial high-level recommendations from the technical paper. It has also seen the establishment of a number of National Treasury coordinated working groups, looking at things such as TCFD, scenarios around climate transition, looking at sustainable finance and specifically a green finance taxonomy for South Africa, which will outline what type of investments qualify as green finance opportunities. And so there's a lot of work currently underway, and we encourage you to look at the National Treasury website. We'll also provide some shortcuts to some of these resources via the project website, which DNA is hosting. The Code for Responsible Investing in South Africa is also currently undergoing a review. It was released in its first iteration also at the same time as Regulation 28, going back about 10 years. And the code is currently being redrafted to make it fit for purpose, to broaden the application of CRISA to all asset classes and to all types of investors and corporate entities. And the intention is for the updated code to be publicly launched either later this year or very early next year, based on the final round of consultations with stakeholders. You're all probably very familiar with King 4 and all that King 4 introduced with it, including the reporting against the 6 capitals by means of reporting by means of an integrated report, demonstrating the kind of outputs and outcomes of integrated thinking. And so, King has long included the responsibility for organizations, not just for-profit entities like companies, but indeed all governing bodies of all organizations to report on those material issues, whether they are financial or non-financial, that could have a material impact on the operations of the company over the short, medium, and long term. And then the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and the listing requirements, again, reinforcing the importance of application of the King Code on corporate governance, as well as the publishing of an integrated report on an annual basis. Again, a lot of these initiatives are, seeking to keep pace with a lot of the international developments. And as Melanie said earlier, there are important developments internationally under the Value Reporting Foundation, also under the International IFRS Foundation around global sustainability reporting frameworks and harmonizing a lot of these frameworks and requirements for both reporting organizations, but also the users and beneficiaries of that information. It would be remiss of us to host this webinar, but not to leave you with a few recommendations. These are recommendations from a report by EY published earlier this year, especially in light of all of the current activity in the broader sustainability reporting and standard space. And we'll provide the link to the report via our resource platform on the website. But effectively, the recommendations from EY and from a number of other related initiatives is that, the encouragement is not to wait for hard regulation to come into play. This could be in terms of the new IFRS developments, as well as that under the Value Reporting Foundation, or it could be in terms of moves to make TCFD aligned reporting mandatory. It's important that reporting organizations already start on their reporting journey, get the experience, get the processes in place, so that when harder regulatory requirements arrive, you're well positioned to be able to respond to that regulation. I think it's also critically important that there's strong buy-in for climate related reporting under ESG reporting at board level, making sure that there is strategic buy-in from those in positions of governance within our organizations, whether these are for-profit or non-profit entities. The board has the opportunity to focus the minds of management and to incentivize behavior, and has an important role to play in managing organizational risk. When it comes to reporting on these data points, EY is encouraging that the data should be assured by an external third party. This can assist with the comparability and the robustness and the consistency of the data that is reported, and should also help with comparability of information for investors and other stakeholders making use of this information. There's also a recommendation that we need to move away from working in silos. Climate risk requires organizations in very different roles within organizations to work together, whether that is in the actual gathering and collecting of climate-related information and data points, the management of climate-related risk, the allocation of capital or investment into new processes and systems, R&D, as we were hearing earlier. And so it definitely does require both those in the sustainability field, but also in the finance field to work together. It's also encouraged that organizations participate in a lot of these discussions which are underway, join the policy discussions, have your voice heard, and work in terms of raising awareness with colleagues and other partners. These webinars are intended to assist with facilitating information sharing and capacity building, and that is indeed one of the recommendations from this EY report in terms of the future of sustainability reporting and frameworks. So with that, that brings us to the end of the formal presentations, but we do want to provide some time now for Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing, and it's an opportunity for you to raise any questions that you might have in terms of the chat function. So you're welcome to use the chat function if you'd like to post any questions in there. Otherwise, if you'd like to raise your questions verbally, you're welcome to do so as well. I think some of our presenters have unfortunately had to leave by 30:30 for other commitments, but please do feel free to use the Q&A function. What I'd also like to request is, Safaka, if you wouldn't mind just loading those initial polling questions, please, just so that we can understand who is in the room today, and also just some views around certain aspects. So the first question is, who are you representing, or what sector are you representing in today's webinar? Are you a sustainability practitioner or consultant? Are you a corporate sustainability reporting practitioner or consultant? Do you represent civil society, academia, or government? Perhaps you have an investor or stakeholder relations role. Are you from the financial sector, such as pensions? Are you a consultant or a trustee or an investment manager representative? Or do you fall into the category of other? So that's great. It seems like we have almost 50% from the broader investment industry. The remaining catch-all bucket is other. It would be interesting to dive into the other sectors that are represented in terms of other participants, and then 10% from the sustainability field. Great that you could all join us today. Thanks, Safako. If we could have the next question, please. So we're keen to understand to what extent climate risk considerations form part of your organization's current operational framework. Are you currently involved in actively considering climate risk in your organizations? Yes or no, or not sure? So it looks like the vast majority at almost, well, at 80%. Good to hear that your organizations are currently considering climate risk. And I'm sure there's work underway in terms of those who've responded no or not sure. Thank you, Safaku. We can close this poll and let's open the last one. Well, I think there might be 2 more to go. The question is, in your opinion, does the responsibility for disclosing climate-related information sit primarily with companies or investors, or both? And these polls are sometimes a little bit limiting. I think it would be very interesting to hear some views on this as well. So the vast majority saying that both corporates and investors have a role to play in disclosing on climate-related information. Thanks, Safaka. I think we can move to the next poll, please. And the last one, in your opinion, do South African stakeholders benefit from the currently available climate-related disclosure? So is what's available in terms of climate risk disclosures satisfactory, or is there room for improvement? Okay, so 55% saying no, and then 20% yes, and 25% not sure. Thanks, Safaku. We can end that poll. Okay, then I'm going to ask if we can also have the post-webinar survey link placed into the meeting chat, please, so that those that have joined, thank you. Thank you, Bianca. So if we can request, and again, please, if there are any questions, please feel free to ask them in the chat function or to raise your hand. But if we can request everybody to take 5 to 8 minutes to respond to the survey feedback form, which has been placed into the chat function. We need to provide this to UK PACT as the funder for these complimentary webinars. It would be great if you could take 5 minutes to respond to that before the hard end of the webinar. So please do click through on that SurveyMonkey link, and please can we ask that you do complete that survey, and if you could do that now while we wait to see if there are any further questions. At this stage, I'm not seeing any hands or further questions, which is fine. So please, if you could do those surveys, that survey, then also just to mention that we will be uploading this webinar recording onto the resource link and website that DNA is hosting. And I think that resource link has been provided in the meeting chat. So you can just click through that and it'll probably be loaded by Monday at the latest. Also, just to mention that if you're a pension fund trustee or a principal officer, this webinar and the subsequent other webinars in the series have been accredited for Batseta CPD. And so all we need you to do is to please get in touch with ourselves through the contact details that you would have received, just to say that you would like to get the benefit of that CPD, and we will issue you with a CPD certificate. Unfortunately, at this stage, it only extends to principal officers and trustees of retirement funds. That is the accreditation that we have for this webinar series. As you would have heard earlier when Brent was introducing the project and this webinar series, this is the first of 4 webinars that we'll be hosting on the theme climate and investment, and making sure that we cover the basics of climate-related financial disclosures. If you haven't yet had an opportunity to register for the other 3 sessions in the series, we'd encourage you to please do so. And you can do that via the same link that you would have used to register for today's webinar. And please do feel free to invite colleagues or anybody else that you feel would benefit from joining these webinars over the course of the next few weeks. They are complimentary, and we'd love to have a full house in all of these webinars. I'm not seeing any questions coming through or any hands raised, so I'm going to ask if any of the co-presenters would like to conclude with any closing remarks. Otherwise, I think we can consider the formal proceedings closed. So are there any colleagues who would like to make any closing remarks? Okay, it doesn't look like it. So on behalf of the project team, let me thank you for your time this afternoon and your participation. Thank you very much to all of those who actively participated by asking questions and making comments in the chat function. We look forward to hosting you for the second of our webinar sessions, which will be taking place next week. Please do get in touch with us directly if you've got any further comments or feedback or questions. Thank you so much for joining us. And if I can just implore you to please make sure that you do complete that survey form. That will ensure that our funders are kept happy and we'll be able to offer these types of webinars in the near future. Have a good afternoon, and thanks very much for joining us.